Maybe. I mean, we started in sort of a conceptual way, and when we started, we weren't really playing shows all the time. So it was kind of a challenge to be on the road for like, 2 years straight where you're performing for months at a time. I've always played music, I've always sang, but that's like a different kind of level of intensity. And I think everyone who goes on their first couple tours, all the singers at least, like whether you're singing in like a really harsh, noisy thing or like melodic thing, you always lose your voice because the weather sucks, the monitors suck, you can't hear yourself. You're always pushing and screaming more than you need to. You're always hanging out with friends from wherever. You're always drinking. You're ruining your body. So like all those things while trying to sing on top of that is a balance. So I think it was a learning experience. I more or less have it, I think, okay now, but I wouldn't say there's an expertise to it or anything. I mean, when I was really young, I listened to the Everly Brothers a lot and Buddy Holly, a lot of the big 50s stuff, the Big Bopper, all the people that died. Jim Carroll too, but I wouldn't say that I took any vocal cues from him other than maybe some lyrical cues. Yeah, I don't know. American Songbook stuff, Gershwin, Fred Astaire singing George Gershwin, I really liked a lot. Was really into the 50s style of musical movies where, everybody would sing the action that would happen. Of course, yeah. That's the movie that made Cheek to Cheek famous, the song. Yeah, I mean, the whole movie is incredible. It was weird to come of age in the late 90s, early 2000s because rock music was so hilarious and like, it was like everything sounded like wrestling theme songs or whatever. So like the voices were always really affected and like macho, and I could never really sing that way. I was in a couple bands where I tried to scream and I just like couldn't do it. So I think eventually I just kind of went the other way where I was just singing, I don't know. It's been a long time. And then, yeah, I feel like the older I get, the more into Scott Walker and Leonard Cohen territory it goes. And it's just going to be kind of like this record, I think my voice is kind of like deeper on a lot of stuff. And a lot of my friends are like, how are you going to sing that live? I'm like, I don't know. I'll just try. Yeah, I mean, even the records were never, I mean, even when they were noisy, it's not like we were just like screaming or pushing a bunch of stuff. It was mostly like a dynamic thing. And then, yeah, live, we wouldn't even play the songs. Sometimes we would just kind of mess on a bunch of stuff. So I think now when it came to like trying to play the songs, reproduce the songs, trying to do other stuff, it became more interesting to pull it in more and have the band sort of listen to each other more. And Dave, I think, just likes to play clean guitar and doesn't even really like to play distortion anymore.
He's right.
I think it's kind of like a COIL thing, where they're just like, they were like, we'll never play live. And then eventually they were like, okay, we'll play live, But that's different too because like it was, I think for a band like that, it was technology. They were doing so many things with tape manipulation and tape loops. They were doing a lot of, there was a lot of like weird stuff that they were doing with electronic music that live didn't necessarily translate, or they weren't interested in doing it live. For us, the first record we hardly played at all because it was all samples. There's like a lot of production now where people kind of use samples in order to like change the live show or to make the live show more professional. I think for our first record, it was like the least professional way of using samples. It was more an obsession with tape music and yeah, just like weird. We were interested in minimalism to some extent, and I think that got us interested in using samples. And then the second record, I bought a drum machine, and that basically made it so we could play live more. And then it just kind of progressed from there. But it was always sort of heavily conceptual. But live is really fleeting, and it's kind of difficult. Like I think for a musician, you have to, I guess, do live stuff on personal terms. That can be more difficult than the record because the record is like it's like a canvas that you control. You can do anything with it, and live, there's a whole lot of limitation. Every night you're going into a different room with a different equipment, different speakers, different sizes. Everybody's in a different state. So I feel like it can be like super difficult to translate it. And yeah, in the early days, we weren't even interested in translating it whatsoever. We were only interested in the ritual side of it. It's like sounds like ripping paper or something sent through a distortion pedal. We recorded Dave playing a plate. Yeah.
It's a plate with focaccia on it that we recorded in Italy, and it just sounded just right. Just the littlest bite of focaccia.
Yeah. And also there's a shutter on on a camera. So like the camera I had, the shutter opening and closing is on that. We recorded that with it too. And that song was kind of like a Burroughs-y like approach to writing a music. Like the style was cut up, the chorus was cut up. Like everything in that song was like made deliberately in a spliced up kind of way, just to kind of get away from sort of the other sounds on the record. But that song was more about sort of the sound and less about the parts. And we were trying to make like a different sound, like a completely different sound, I guess. Yeah, which is cool. He's the only beat that I think is kind of like still relevant. You know, it's funny with Bob Dylan getting this recognition from this academic world and him not being interested in it. I mean, I still like Bob Dylan, but Burroughs, I think, is the most versatile out of... There's definitely like some smaller figures in the beat movement that I was really interested in. Amiri Baraka and John Giorno. You know, there's a lot of other poets. I was really into Ed Sanders and the Fugs. But Burroughs was really interesting because it was cynical in a way that outlasted the 60s, outlasted the 50s. I mean, that's I think a lot of the problem with Ginsberg or like some of the other people who were like, we're trying to start a revolution, and then ultimately sort of it fell flat. The 90s, I feel like, were full of that, just sort of like hippies turned yuppies. And I feel like Burroughs back in the day was like, don't expect it to get any better, you know. It's cynical in a way that I think people growing up, you know, under a collapsing government or under a collapsing economy can read and still resonate with. And also, I mean, just the fact that, you know, he was living kind of on the outside of society, as opposed to talking about a utopia or this like idea of revolution towards utopia. He just sort of was apolitical in the same way Black Flag was or something. I was having a record low amount of sex during the record. It's like probably the least sexy time of my life, which is not to say it was bad. It was a learning process. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was hard because I think a lot of the records that we did, we'd always like try to tie concepts to like an entire idea. Like Children of Desire was like this idea of wanting and losing, and Total Night was just about sort of madness. After the End was sort of like the calm after a traumatic event. And then this one was just sort of like, we had done so many of these records that were obsessed with sort of negative themes that I feel like we started to deconstruct those ideas. And lyrically, I think every theme that we've ever touched on is in this record, but not in an intentional way. And like this record is more like a product of my subconscious. Maybe that's also like me projecting on it because that was what I was interested in. I was reading Dream Analysis and Carl Jung, and I was really interested in sort of symbols and what they meant. And so I feel like there was this approach to the record where it's like, you know, disconnected symbols in the same way that the human mind dreams, and all the ideas were kind of coming from everywhere. I mean, I read a review where someone said that we finally learned how to write love songs, and I thought that was like the dumbest thing I've ever read about our band. It's like so stupid, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, each song kind of has its own little like vignette. Crystal Cage was just sort of about rejecting your life in lieu of passion and your instincts, I guess. I feel like my world was betraying my instincts and I had to leave. There's also some themes borrowed from Joseph Cornell, the American surrealist. Not really a surrealist. He's more of a just like freak shut-in that was friends with Marcel Duchamp. And the name was inspired by like this weird piece that he did, this printed piece that was like, he's kind of shown up a lot in the work. He's been somebody who I was really like interested in. But the theme was just, it's a theme about rejecting life in the same way, you know, in a very Ibsen kind of way. This idea that you know, everyone's comfort allows them to live this life this way. But if they were to realize a life outside of their comfort, they would see the deficit. They would see like the inadequacy of their life. You know, if they went for if they left the comfort and went for a more spiritual path. Music has been sort of a weird spiritual guiding force in my life, more than, you know, like any kind of religion I think could be. And it's a lot of risk taking, and you sometimes wake up and have to leave your entire life and move on. And so like I feel like the themes were like pretty evident in that song. End of the Week was sort of a specific scene, you know, but again, End of the Week was not written to be interpreted directly, I guess. It was meant to exist in a sort of abstract sense where there's supposed to be scenes and flashes and things that are cut together, and they're sort of, you know, the lack of continuity is the idea or whatever. Lonesome Sound, I think, is sort of a straightforward approach to just my obsession with mythology, but also whatever personal experience of abandonment. Yeah, Dave wrote that. Dave wrote that song a long time ago, but I have been trying to force him to put it on a merchandise record for 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much just being alone and unknowable, and we are all that, and that's about as much as I can go into about it. Hey, thanks, man. I came from a very dark place, so I'm glad it can reach some people.
It came from Florida.
It came from the dark bowels of the swamp.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, we have a big history going back just being obsessed. Like, Carson and I would watch the Psychic TV Black Joy DVD every day at our house 5 years ago, before making Children of Desire and the first merchandise records. Yeah. So, yeah, we were very deep into that and Throbbing Gristle and all the old industrial stuff.
Einstein's and Neubauten, and yeah. I mean, the list is really long. And then, obviously, like, Minimalism and Terry Riley and Lamont Young, Stockhausen, Tony Conrad, Pierre Henry. Like, those were all sort of our interests, at least coming into experimental music. And that was the foundation. It wasn't just like we just bought pedals or something and started messing with them. But, like, there was sort of a pretty strong foundation, I think, for that. And especially this record, I was listening to the Scatology COIL demos a lot, which are just phenomenal. They're as good as like a record to me. There's also quite a bit of new industrial stuff. Yeah, Drew McDowell, my friend Renee does Horoscope, Justin Lakes is Shredded Nerve, Pedestrian Deposit, Sword Heaven, R.I.P. They're an old band that, you know, an old industrial band that was from Ohio that, you know, broke up years ago, but we used to see them and listen to them quite a bit. Lazy Magnet. I don't know. There was a weird crew of strange industrial stuff coming out of Providence, Rhode Island, coming out of Carrboro. There was definitely, out of Tampa, out of Florida. For being a punk kid and looking and being interested in Psychic TV or Sonic Youth or Lydia Lunch or Swans or whatever, I think we kind of immediately went towards the weirder stuff that was happening on the East Coast, especially during the early 2000s. And that was there was a big scene for a lot of that music. So it didn't even feel like that isolated that you were finding this old music. But yeah, I mean, we've always been sort of interested in that, but we haven't really been limited to. That's kind of where we clash with all those things. Minimalism and industrial music is we really liked listening to Merle Haggard too, and Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead and Scott Walker, people who can compose perfect songs. I know that list is very crazy. Yeah. But it's not that crazy, I guess, because that was what I got into. And then, so I think there is there is a divide between a lot of different places. There's people that are looking to get away from Western styles of songwriting completely. And then, you know, we were just sort of grabbed by a lot of different sort of sounds. And we were really interested with the idea of new things. And again, those ideas weren't just coming from like a music scene. It was like definitely an interest in Burroughs, an interest in futurism, an interest in surrealism. Just using dreams as ways of finding things. Again, it came from filmmaking. You know, we were heavily into Antonioni and Andrei Tarkovsky, and, you know, a lot of really sort of heavy cinematic things that I think also, you know, interpreted or influenced whatever we were interested in. Whether or not they came across is interesting to see, but like we would always try to be in some kind of cinematic way. Yeah, I don't know. It kind of is more, I mean, there's electronic things, there's sampling used again. The last record, we were trying to make a record where it was completely live and we just don't really work that way. I don't think we're that interested in reproducing songs live or even playing singles over and over again. And we kind of learned that the hard way by recording a whole live record, which is also cool. I mean, I still think it's a cool way to produce a record and make something, but this one, I don't know. The last record, I eliminated electronics because, again, lack of technology. I just didn't know how. I'm from the swamp. I don't know how to make a sampler sync up with a band. When Dave and I were playing shows and it was just keyboards, we just did renditions of stuff that were completely different. Eventually, we started to try to replicate the songs as best as we could. And now I think it's kind of the perfect mix of doing something new and doing something old. But yeah, I mean, there is a classic, I guess, 480 sound, more on it. But I think
that's always been so deeply ingrained into our brains, even from the first LP we did. We were always so obsessed with those 4AD records, and I feel like just this one, we sort of just went for a more natural approach, like we did with our earlier records, and just recorded songs without even figuring out how we would ever do them live, and doing that all reverse engineering. And I guess it just kind of sounds 4AD in that way.
It's just just how we sound, I guess.
It wasn't totally intentional, but
yeah.
I'm obsessed with creation. I love all that stuff. Felt is my all-time favorite. All my guitar lines are ripped off.
Yeah, if you can't tell, it's a very felty guitarist.